Hello, I'm Todd Phillips, the editor of Canadian Auto Dealer. We're here today with Chris Walsh. He's the president of Reynolds Reynolds. Chris, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Todd. Good afternoon.
Well, we're here to talk about the evolution of the consumer purchase experience with a focus on really the digitization and, if you will, digital retailing. There was a time when digital retailing was really the buzzword that was across the industry, but increasingly post-pandemic, digital retailing has become retailing. It just becomes something that all dealers really need to adapt and pivot to. So we're going to talk about some of the pain points that the new technologies are trying to address for dealers for the consumer experience. We're going to start, Chris, with sort of the differences in the numbers, if you will, getting an online quote, filling out some sort of a digital retailing experience, getting a payment term, and showing up at the dealership, and there's a disconnect between what's then presented to you at the dealership. It creates sort of a loss of trust and transparency sort of right out of the gate. So it's not a great place to start a relationship with the consumer. So what are you seeing with your dealers and some of the tools available to help sort of narrow that gap on that front? So
yeah, so when we first got into looking at digital retailing and what we wanted to do, we spent a lot of time looking at the market and seeing what was available right now and how this was really going to work. And one of the things we noticed was that there was a real possibility of there being a real disconnect on the math, right? So the customer's online on a digital retailing tool and they get a payment of $379 on a 60-month deal. Then they go in store and they start working the deal in a desk environment, an F&I environment. That payment now is they get a payment of $399, and they were like, why is the price difference? And there's immediately this veil of transparency that disappears for the customer, and that's really one of the things that they're looking for from an experience perspective, is to have transparent pricing. So now you've just diluted that for the consumer, which is really what they wanted. It created issues. So, and the problem was you had a calculation engine in the digital retailing tool, you had a calculation engine potentially in your desking tool, and you had a calculation engine in your F&I tools. So you had all these different calculation engines, and they just didn't match. And when you think about a payment, you got to take into consideration things like rebates and incentives, taxes and fees, and if they vary across those calculation engines, that's where you're going to get your discrepancy. So how do you keep up with all those things so it has the same fees all the time? And the answer is one calculation engine is what you need to use. That's the way to do it. So that's the approach that we took in doing it, to create a better experience for the consumer, both online and in store.
And it sounds wonderfully simple and easy to do, but it's not really easy to pull off. As you mentioned, incentives and rebates, that's all a real-time environment, finance rates and stuff. So how does that sort of one approach? I guess there's a lot of technology and data in behind that to deliver that seamless experience, right?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of data and technology. And, it's when you start looking at things like this, you're reminded of the fact that when you think about retailing automobiles, it is easily the most complex retailing environment that exists in North America, in my opinion. There's nothing that you buy. I would even argue it's easier to buy a house sometimes than it is to buy, a vehicle. So it's a complex model, when you think about it, and we have to find ways to simplify that, both for the consumer and for the end user, our customers. So yeah, it was a lot of work to get it done, but that's where we landed.
Well, the other thing that's directly connected to that is the promise is really an omni-channel experience, where what you do online, you transition seamlessly to the store. They know who you are. You've given them all this information, whether it's financing information down to the model and trim of a car, sometimes even the F&I products you want to edit on to that deal. And you come in really having volunteered an awful lot of stuff online, and you show up and sometimes you're treated as the next up, like, hey, who are you, Mr. Jones? What are you here to talk about today? And the consumers are sort of baffled, in the sense that I provided an awful lot of information, can't you look that up? So that gap still exists, I guess. So what are you doing sort of as a company and working with your dealer partners to make that a bit more seamless, so that the online experience sticks, if you will, or migrates into the dealership world?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is that if you would wind the clock back, say 4 years, and look forward, I think we all thought, consumers buying cars completely online was going to be more prolific than it is today. So it just hasn't transformed to that degree, but it's become more complicated in other ways, right? Because our customer is going to buy a car completely in an in-store experience? Yes. Our customers going to do a bunch of research online and then come in to the dealership? Yes. Our customers going to buy cars completely online, including the signing ceremony? Yes. I mean, all those things are true and to varying degrees are happening today. So, when we looked at that, we just tried to figure out, because your point is very valid, right? So if you've got a customer that is, the hybrid model, right? So they're doing, some research online, then they come into the dealership. That's primarily what we're seeing today. And there's variations about how much research they do online, but that's the model that we're seeing. And, when that customer does all that research and maybe they land on a VDP and they land on a vehicle, maybe they get the payments, maybe they don't, maybe they've done their trade, maybe they don't, but they've got some information. And then they come into the dealership, they can't feel like this is the first time that you've met. It has to feel like it's just a continuation of a process that already started. So when you walk in, it's like, I'm Todd Phillips. I've been working with, Greg Euland and looking at a new SUV. Oh, great, Todd. Yep. We're very familiar. Come on and sit down. So last we talked, this is where we were. Here's next steps. Do you have a trade? And maybe you go through that process in store if you haven't done it online, but it just should be a continuation of that online experience. And it has to feel seamless to the customer. So if you're redoing things, in store that they already did online, that's going to be really frustrating, to a lot of people because if they're doing things online, they're trying to condense the sales cycle, right? They're trying to do more online, spend less time in the dealership. When you start doing those kinds of things, it's going to feel like I'm spending more time in the dealership, which is what I didn't want to do.
You raise a good point. I guess part of it, it's sort of oversaid in our industry in general talking about these things, but if you think about the Amazonification of the experience, it's amazing how much they know about me, how easy it is for me to order. I recognize the vehicle is much more complex, but they know me. There's a recommendation engine that's suggesting, hey, last time you looked at this, maybe you should. It feels like a very familiar relationship with something like, oh, these guys know me pretty damn well. I order a lot of guitar equipment and whatnot, and they feed me all kinds of recommendations. So you don't really get that in the dealership experience. But you mentioned time. That's a key component I want to focus on too, because that inline, sort of that in-store experience, we know from survey after survey, they want to spend less time in there. They want to, get in and get out. And that whole process has to be seamless. It can't be, people running around finding different managers for approval, or even in the process of putting in offers and F&I products in front of them that takes too long. So some of your tools, whether you want to speak to DocuPad or others, I know are aimed at sort of digitizing that in-store experience as well. Maybe talk about some of the progress made there and what you're hearing from your dealer members about the popularity of some of those tools.
So if you think about traditional, car buying experience where the customer goes into a dealership and I'm looking at a Tahoe and they start to talk about the different trim levels and maybe into payments a little bit, that process has already started online. So the deal, as we know it, has already started. So when the customer comes in, it should be a question of, pulling up the deal, on the DMS and just continuing, with the deal, just like you're continuing with the overall process. So when you have, one digital retailing tool that's completely integrated with one desking tool, that's completely integrated with an F&I tool and an accounting tool, that's what allows everything to flow more smoothly. And that's where I think you get into, the time savings, right? So it's we're not rebuilding a deal or recalculating things to go back to the calculation engine, because even though you may be able to recalculate a deal or kind of redo a deal quickly, it's still time to that consumer. And that 2 minutes to the consumer could feel like 10 or 15 minutes, to them. So it's a different, perception of time. But I also think you think about it from, the dealership, perspective as well. So when you're doing that, we're saving time, for the dealership so they can talk about other things that they might want to do, with that customer, depending on whether it's aftermarket products and F&I or whatever it happens to be, or whether it's just, relationship building and getting to know the customer, a little bit better, or it's an existing customer. And maybe you spend time talking about their family and you realize they've got a 16-year-old son or daughter that's going to be in the market for a car. Maybe that spurs, a whole different, conversation. So I think there's time savings on both sides. And when, one of the areas, that we really wanted to focus on was that workflow. How do we condense that workflow, but also don't lose the efficiency that's gained for the customer and the dealership, the effectiveness of working the deal, and then still maintain control over the accuracy and the profitability of the transaction on the dealership side, which was really an initial concern when we started getting into the whole notion of, digital retailing. A lot of retailers were concerned. I'm not going to have control anymore. They're not going to buy F&I products if they buy things online. And we're not seeing that right now. The way we looked at doing it, they still have control over the accuracy and profitability. And we are seeing just as much, if not increases, in consumers buying F&I products, even though they might not be in a traditional F&I office, because it's just a different experience for them. You mentioned Amazon, a minute ago. It's kind of like that Amazon experience. Customers that bought this car generally bought these, aftermarket products, and a lot of times people will just buy them.
Yeah, you mentioned, the dealers and sort of, what's going on in their world. The last question I really have is for you is regarding the feedback from dealers, because obviously you're rolling out these new products. You deal with thousands of dealers across both Canada and the US. What's their feedback as they see some of these new tools sort of bridge that gap? The promise they've been trying to close is not for want of trying that they haven't, but they've had a whole, web of different software platforms trying to piece it together. So once you sort of explain this vision to them, what's the feedback when you kind of roll it out within their stores or walk them through it?
Yeah, I think for the most part, dealers in, North America have accepted, this is kind of the new reality, and it's going to continue to progress, in the next several years into something different than it is today. How prolific, people are going to buy things completely online, kind of remains to be seen. I think inventory, issues will probably help drive some of that change or not change, depending on, what happens there. But I think generally they've looked at it. You kind of touched on this at the beginning, and not looking at it as digital retailing. We kind of tend to anchor in the concept of, retail anywhere. So it's not digital retailing. For us, it's retail anywhere. So you can retail online, you can retail in store, you can retail in a combination of the two. And if you choose to do that, which most people are, we're going to provide a seamless experience for the consumer so that when they do come in that store, it just feels like now it's face to face, but all the information is just flowing from a digital experience into a in-person experience. So the feedback has been, really positive about it, and I think they're starting to recognize that this hybrid model is really what we're going to see for the foreseeable future.
And the last takeaway really is, I guess we'll get a chance to see you and dealers, Canadian and otherwise, at NADA this year in February. So I'm sure that if they want to see some of these tools in actions, your people will be happy to walk them through some of that at the booth, right?
Yeah, I'd love to see as many Canadian dealers in our booth as I can. I know there are, uniqueness to retailing vehicles in Canada versus, the United States. And, the more that I can learn about, the challenges that Canadian dealers face, the more educated I become, the more educated our company becomes. So I'd love to talk to anyone, that has time to stop by about just, their business and how things are going and what we can do to help them be successful. We are really, really excited about our acquisition of Deskit, which is a desking and a digital retailing tool that is, based in Canada, was built for Canadian dealers, and it's one of the most exciting acquisitions I think we've made in the last couple of years, and the opportunity for us to provide something that is an enhanced workflow for Canadian dealers is really, really exciting for me, and we're really excited to show as many Canadian dealers as we can, what we can do to help them in this space.
Well, great, Chris. Well, thanks for the time today, and I'll look forward to possibly catching up with you at NADA in a couple months. So,
yeah, please stop by. It's great seeing you, Todd.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Take care.